Hi guys, we are back again with the MIKU Podcast. I can't believe we are already on our 4th episode of Part 3. For those who have followed us since Part 1 during the epilogue and Part 2, Korean holidays, thank you so much for your support and interest so far. It's a little sad since we will be concluding our series soon on the next episode. However, I do have some exciting news. So it's regarding the topic of today's episode, which is Frank Schofield and our special guest. If you guys remember from Part 2, there was a special MC. Well, he is back again. Let's welcome Andrew Lim. Hello.
Hi, hello everybody. It's great to be back, actually. As I mentioned, as a Canadian citizen, I love talking about Canadian history. Also, I'm in Korea. I love talking about Korean history and how they all relate together. So for those of the audience who probably maybe have met me for the first time today, let me give you a quick introduction. So my name is Andrew Lim, and I currently work as a research and innovation attaché at the Quebec Government Office in Seoul. So yes, I'm a government official for Canada, and I'm a Canadian citizen. So this is very, very meaningful for me. But before I begin, you mentioned MIKU Podcast.
Yes,
maybe you could give me a little bit of a background on this MIKU word. It's kind of cute.
Right. So you might know a little bit from being MC in the Part 2. So MIKU stands for Melt into Korea with Us. And basically the reason why and the whole goal, again, for this series, at the end of it, we hope that viewers, the foreigners, and even Koreans have a little deeper understanding of our topics, which would be, Korean public holidays, along with missionaries or foreigners that had a huge impact in Korean history.
So then this MIKU, who came up with this? It's very, it rolls off the tongue, MIKU.
Sure, they had a few kind of ideas. I wasn't there for the brainstorming, but our team, they came up with it and they ended up with this, as you said, it's kind of like cute. They wanted that kind of image.
Yes.
So that's how they came up with and decided to go with MIKU.
Okay, I just actually wondered because maybe some of the audience, maybe it's their first time
They might be curious,
and they might be a bit curious because I think names are very important. So, last time, yes, I did talk about the National Foundation Day with the Yen.
I saw it.
Yes, I enjoyed it a lot.
And I want to say thank you for taking the lead for that as I wasn't available. And you were great, by the way. And I think it made a very good collaboration with Yen, our team member.
Thank you. I'm always, I'm always glad to help, and especially talking about my Canadian roots.
And again, I felt like, especially for this episode, we are talking about Frank Schofield, who is Canadian, and actually the only Canadian missionary that we're talking about in our Part 3 series. So when we're also thinking about who to bring to today's episode, obviously, Andrew, you were the first one we thought of after, our good relationship with you. And, this is only one of few collaborations, but hopefully if there's more opportunities, we can continue more.
That'll be great.
That'll be fun.
It's also because, like in Korea, many people have heard of Canada, I'm sure. They kind of know where it is. It's north of America, et cetera, et cetera. But if I mention Canada, they might say stuff like maple syrup or like maybe at most poutine, for example. But
I don't think they would even know that is,
true,
right? You have to say
actually.
fries with gravy.
That's
how they would know.
That's true. So they don't really know. So I kind of wanted to, share some knowledge on how close Korea, Canada actually is. The historical perspectives to trade, to immigration and studying. There's a lot going on. And as a official, I do know this and I'm part of that. So I kind of wanted to share with the Korean people, or I guess that's the audience to kind of show Canada and Korea, they're very close. And also, this year, it's Quebec and Korea's 30th year anniversary of relations. Yes, it works out perfectly.
Yeah, that's great.
30 years is a long time.
It is. And besides 30 years, beyond that, Schofield on to decades ago, right? So that relationship started from back and 1800s, so forth, until now, the relationship has been strong. But, 30-year commemoration is a beautiful thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And just to kind of give a bit more of a background, so I immigrated to Canada when I was really young, like when I was 5. And I found out someone recently that actually went through the Quebec team because they expedite immigrations quicker than the actual federal government. So I actually went through this office that I guess my dad kind of went through their conferences or their talks on immigration. He applied and we immigrated to Montreal first. So I kind of went through the Quebec immigration system through the actual team I'm working for today in Korea. And now I kind of circle back as an adult. Now I start working for them. So it's very meaningful.
It's very amazing to see that.
Yes, so it's good to be here once again.
And actually, right before we get into our topic, I just want to say that, Andrew, thank you so much for taking your time out. With all the whole Corona situation, it's limited to people, certain amount of people at certain broadcasting or different activities. So, and I know the situation will get better.
Yes.
So hopefully when we get more activities like this, we can invite more people to talk on our podcasts and we can have better, conversations and stuff.
More the merrier, I always say. So this is great. Thank you. All
right. So actually, I'm excited to get started. And going on to our topic, just so far in this introduction, it just feels like MC. All right. So I'm excited to get started. And as we're just doing this introduction here, it just feels more like an MC and a special MC rather than a MC and a guest. So I like that kind of connection that we have going on for this theme of the episode. So getting started with today's topic, Frank William Schofield. He was a British-born Canadian, but what he is most known for is his actions involved with the March 1st movement.
Yes, that's actually correct. Although he first came to Korea in 1916, which was a long time ago, over 100 years ago as a missionary. And he originally lectured on bacteriology at the Severance Union Medical College, which is probably known as Severance Hospital today. He started seeing how the Japanese colonial rule were treating Koreans.
And during that time period, there were actually a handful of missionaries. Most known in Canada was Frank Schofield. However, a few Americans also came with him. And, what about Schofield that made him different than the other missionaries? So
that's a great point. Unlike most other missionaries at this troubling time in Korea, he went beyond just expressing the shared sentiment of no neutrality for brutality by calling for independence of the Korean people through various channels, such as English media publication, namely Japan Advertiser, Seoul Press, etc. So he did a lot more work than just kind of seeing, but he actually kind of advocated and showed the world that there is some issues that need to be tackled here.
So the actions that he took, it could have, put his life at rest. Those are quite dangerous things to do, especially with the Japanese colonization, being on the embark and watching everyone like that. And if he got caught, what was the worst thing that could have happened to him then?
Oh, I think it would have been very, very bad. I mean, if he was caught, he might have been thrown in jail or worse, get tortured or hurt by the Japanese colonial rulers. However, since he was actually not Korean and kind of as a foreigner, you're supposed to stay kind of neutral toward, Japanese government kind of staying neutral toward foreigners. Maybe he would have been deported back to Canada probably. Yes, but what's also interesting is as a British-born Canadian, if you think about this, back in the days, they still had this notion of the Commonwealth. They still have it too, but even back then a lot more so. He kind of had the motherland British and the one of the, I guess, supposed colonies long ago, Canada. I think that's very also interesting as well.
Because of his nationality and his background, it's kind of like even if he did something wrong or he kind of went against the Japanese rule, it'll be kind of like maybe his first strike kind of. And then if the Japanese were to touch him at any point, the Japanese would have gotten much in trouble by the government for
Yes.
touching one of their national
Yes.
people or citizens, right? So they had to be very careful
Yes.
during those times.
So I guess that's kind of one of his advantages that he had
Right.
that enabled him to do this kind of work.
Yeah, he took advantage
Yes.
of his nationality to be
Yes.
able to show this to the
Yes,
world.
I would assume so.
Yeah. And what are the specific kind of actions that he had led and did?
So some of the specific actions he did, he continued such coverage in certain areas of Korea, some geographical areas such as Sucheon-ri and Jimri, in which he photographed atrocities committed by the Japanese. Yes, so some of the work he did included coverage in certain areas of Korea, which I mean geographically, such as Sucheon-ri and Jeam-ri, in which he photographed atrocities committed by the Japanese, such as luring people in the disguise of meeting and setting fire to places like a church. So thanks to his coverage, many of the photos we see today about these kind of events are from actually his photograph. Most of the photographs we see in history books and the things we learn is mostly actually from him.
So him capturing those times in history really makes a difference to what we can look back and see what had happened.
Oh, definitely.
And actually, for our viewers, those who don't know, Schofield was actually physically challenged, and he had a disability where he had to use a cane to walk. And also, obviously, being a foreigner or a Caucasian in an Asian-dominated country, let alone having this mobile difficulty, it definitely was not easy for him to kind of take these pictures of these events.
That's actually a very good point. Additionally, cameras back then are not the ones we see today.
Right.
Cameras today are smartphones, very miniaturized, very mobile, I would say. But back then, you could imagine, you probably saw like photos of, cameras back in the days in the 1900s. They're very big, mostly black and white, and they're very difficult to kind of carry around.
Exactly.
So he had this physical, kind of challenge. Plus, he had to take these cameras and be still and do all those, technical things. I think it's amazing that he pulled this off.
Just like you said, like cameras here, even if you just press a button and even if you're like shaking your hand, you can still capture some kind of image. But those cameras back then, you really had to have the right lighting and make sure you had the right timing. So it's amazing to be able to take those photos that we're using hundreds of years later.
And as a kind of a camera nerd, this technique is called image stabilization. But obviously they didn't have any of that stuff.
You just had to like do it, and
Yes.
and that's like a lot of pressure to be capturing this kind of moment for the March 1st movement. It's chaotic, right? So it's crazy.
And I could also imagine the the cameras back in the days, they had the film. Do you remember those?
Yeah, I do.
Kodak or Fujifilm, the actual film. Then he would have to go to a dark room and develop and all those things. Wow, I could
it's not just one click and then, okay, let me email this to the press.
I could imagine.
You had to take all this time out to do it. And he is like a really great person for doing that during those really intense moments in history. So besides the few events that you had mentioned, what other actions or events that he did cover?
So thanks to his work at the Severance Hospital, he was able to get a first-hand account of those who suffered from the occupation. Because, those people who suffered would actually, be taken to the hospital. So he would see these torture victims who need treatment. Also, some of his work also included the coverage of the Seodaemun prison, in which prisoners were treated inhumanely. And I think Seodaemun prison now is it turned into kind of a museum to kind of highlight some of these historical moments that Korea had. So.
Actually, Seodaemun prison is not that far from where I live. So I have been wanting to go. But with the situation right now, I'm still revisiting that plan. But I also recommend other people who hasn't gone yet or will be going to Korea. It's a really historical place that really is, there's a lot of grief in the history. But because it's still, a part of Korean's really old history and it's still intact, very well intact. Definitely recommend people to go there.
Actually, it's very admirable because like I'm not trying to like stereotype anybody, but some people, if they come to Korea, they might be into like K-pop, which is fine. Or like they might go to Myeongdong to shop, although these days maybe it's not doing so well there. But you want to really get into not just like the surface stuff, but you want to really get into it and, you know, visit Seodaemun prison. That's very amazing.
It's not just that, but like it's not that far from me. So I might as well just like, oh, you know what? This is a historical place. And actually there's been a lot of advertisements on trying to get people out to actually go to these places. Because in Korea, and especially in Seoul, there's a lot of famous ways like, you know, like you said, Dongdaemun or Myeongdong. Those are very famous shopping touristy places. But then on the sides of Seoul, there are so many historical places that are connected with, you know, we're talking about missionaries or we talked about Korean holidays before. And it's convenient for me. So there's like no excuse for me not to go. That's what I keep thinking.
Very humble of you. I mean, it's just still good that, you know, foreigners want to learn about Korean history, close or not. So that's very admirable.
I'm like, if I go there, you know, it kind of will take me back to a moment in history of that Seodaemun prison. And I wanted to ask you, you know, if you traveled back in time, if you were in Schofield's shoes and you knew that obviously during Japanese colonization, Japanese soldiers kept a close eye on everyone, right? The Koreans, the foreigners, even their own Japanese people, because there are some Japanese people that actually held Koreans too. There were some kind of like a power struggle. People were picking sides like that. You know, if you openly criticized the Japanese colonial government, obviously, or resisting it, then it was life-threatening.
Oh, definitely.
And, you know, what do you think you would do in that situation? Would you be Schofield? And
I'll be honest.
Would you be in your cane and you would go take those pictures? Or would you sit back and side-eye everyone? Like, it's a really hard your life is at risk.
I'll be honest. I mean, yes, anyone at this moment may be able to say, oh, I would have done the same thing. Right. But I'll be honest, I'm not even sure if I could have had the bravery to do this. I know I shouldn't say this, but if you think about Frank Schofield, I think it was almost like he was destined to do this. All the things he had, like, I don't want to like bring race too much, but still he was Caucasian. That kind of gave him a little bit, I wouldn't say diplomatic immunity, but a little bit of
Definitely
that, as you mentioned.
Advantage,
Yes. And not only that, he seemed very I'm not trying to insult anyone, but a little bit harmless. You know, he's physically challenged. He has a cane. You know, he.
But then he also used it as his advantage,
yes,
right? He's like,
probably,
well, no one's gonna like hurt me if I'm already kind of looking this way. So yeah.
So that kind of shows.
Smart,
So like he was destined to kind of do this because I'm sure he wasn't like I'm gonna be physically challenged to do this, but he was just born this way. He had the knowledge of being a veterinarian, all this thing to kind of. You know, because medicine's very important during those times. So he had like basically all the, I would say, criteria to make him be the exact fit for this kind of role. So yes, maybe others could have done it, but I don't think they would have done it as well. So if it was someone like me, let's say I was born during these times and I wasn't physically challenged, but let's say I had a Canadian citizenship back then. I'm not even sure if the Japanese would recognize things like that because still maybe on the outside I might still look kind of Asian or Korean. I might have a Korean background. So I'm wondering if they still would have treated me the same way.
That's very questionable. Yes. Yeah. I feel like they would have just maybe the simplest way is just say, okay, you're Korean. Yeah, you're Canadian on paper, but you're Korean.
Yes.
That might have happened. It's interesting to hear your side of it. Just wondering about
So that's why I'm not even sure if I would have had that bravery.
It would all be very different.
Yes, but still deep inside, I would have wanted to play my part, kind of to bring about.
Do what you could.
Yes, but I mean, Frank is of a different class.
I think Frank was just his fate because of the way he was born. So then, and it's smart of him. It's smart of him to take advantage of that. So, you know, as we were preparing for this episode, this podcast, and I remember when studying about Frank Schofield, there was also a name that popped up. Lee Kap-sung. So one of the 33 signers of the Declaration of Independence of Korea was heavily involved with what Frank Schofield did.
Yes, that is indeed true. I mean, Frank Schofield had a lot of the photographs and a lot of the, I guess, documented evidence about these things, which kind of led to this Declaration of Independence. I guess you could kind of say Lee Kap-sung was Frank Schofield's like they're partners of this
Right.
independent movement. Very interesting. A Korean and I guess a British Canadian being
Yeah,
partners
yeah.
in this kind of foreign world.
Right.
I think it's an amazing collaboration that
You would think that back then, like, the cultures are very different, and technologies aren't advanced as they are now. So you can feel the distance of nationalities, but they were working together, right?
Oh, definitely, yes. I would say working together, yes, but that would be kind of an understatement. I mean, Lee was one who told Schofield about the March 1st movement in 1919, the day before, and basically saying there would be a declaration of independence on that day, and for him to kind of prepare for it, as in like maybe document it, be together, and kind of be part of the movement.
I see. So going on to the March 1st movement, which is a huge part of Korean's history, can you do a little bit more introduction of
Sure,
March
of
1st
course,
movement,
of
please?
course. So March 1st movement, also known as the Samil movement in Korean, was a protest held on March 1st, 1919, calling for independence from Japan and a protest against forced assimilation oppressed by the Japanese. Inspired by the very famous President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points outlining the right to self-determination, 33 Korean cultural and religious leaders issued a proclamation and read out loud the Korean Declaration of Independence. And numerous demonstrations were held throughout Korea, such as the Pagoda Park in Seoul, which is actually in the Chongla area. It's very famous.
Yeah.
Yes.
So actually, the reason why probably Lee Kap-song had told Frank Schofield, knowing that he's Canadian national, knowing he had these resources, he told him beforehand to prepare for, this whole movement that was going to start. And I'm guessing, after it had happened, Schofield would be able to tell it to the press as soon as possible to get it out to the world.
Oh, yes. So not only that, but Schofield also translated this declaration from Korean to English for it to be sent to the White House, the White House that we know in Washington. It's also interesting. I mean, so I would assume Schofield and Lee probably communicated in Korean, actually. Yes.
Yeah. Unless, we don't know, maybe Lee was good at English.
That's true. Or a hybrid of like Konglish, I guess.
Yeah. Maybe they started Konglish
maybe.
in the 1900s. So, it sounds like he took a lot of roles and responsibility on spreading this historic movement.
Yeah, so that's very true. I mean, eventually, because of his actions of covering all this and his public service to Korea, I mean, he was awarded the Republic of Korea Medal of National Foundation 1968. It's one of the highest honors. And also to celebrate his contribution to Korea, the Canadian Embassy here in Korea, we named one of an area in embassy called Schofield Hall.
Okay.
It's actually the main area on the first floor where we do a lot of the events. Some of the ministers come here. We have like morning breakfast meetings. We have a small area for like buffets, etc. So we always mention this.
Him,
exactly.
They have a whole kind of event area floor for him.
Yes, and whenever we kind of promote embassy events, we say, it's being held in the Canadian Embassy Schofield Hall. We make sure to mention this.
So when can I get a chance to go over there?
I mean, when Corona is over, yes. Actually, and we're not allowing public people to come in at the moment, except they have specific reasons like meetings with some of the trade commissioners or extending their passport. Also, in the basement of the embassy, there's actually a library. It used to be open for the public. Yes, and there's like pictures of Frank Schofield. There's books about him, but obviously it's not open to the public now because of Corona. But I mean, it's a lot of his, his knowledge and documented things, they're
basically
all
like
in
his
there.
A biography library of him honoring him.
And there's also other people too, obviously, but he's a huge part of that library.
Well, hopefully one day our viewers maybe are able to take a visit there. It's amazing to be able to talk about him and study him, and then eventually going to a whole library dedicated would be really interesting to see.
Well, fingers crossed when Corona's over.
Right. Well, as you said, that award that was given to him by the Republic of Korea Medal of National Foundation in 1968, is well deserved for that medal because he had these amazing accomplishments during such a rough time in Korea's history. And even 50 years after his passing, we are still talking about him today. And you had said, many honors of him are still celebrated in his name. And it really, truly makes him, a hero in Korean's history. I wanted to ask, we spent a lot of time talking about his accomplishments and what he had did. He first came over as a missionary, eventually doing all these amazing actions. I want to talk about he himself. What are his values that we can see through his actions? And, is there anything that we can probably learn from him or maybe even relate to him in that sense?
So as you rightly mentioned, yes, he came as a missionary first, so he did have that Christian background. Right. So he kind of had that, mentality of like, be the light, be the salt of the earth, love thy neighbor. And you kind of saw it through his actions. He saw that the kind of people are being subjugated, they weren't being treated right. And with his kind of love thy neighbor mentality, he had to just show it to the world because he knew him as an individual, he can't change this. But if he brings other people in, perhaps he could kind of expedite, the time in where some of these people, their suffering will be lessened. So I think
very selfless.
Yes,
person,
very
right?
selfless.
And I think that we didn't mention this yet, but when he had left Korea, right, he had been kicked out kind of by the Japanese government. But the real the excuse on paper was that he had to take care of his family, his wife. And it wasn't until later he came back again. So you can say his devotion to Korea was for his whole life, almost, from the moment he came in the first time up until his death.
Oh, definitely. Yes, he did a lot for Korea. He shared his knowledge. He lived through the part of history that everyone is learning today. Right. I think that's very big.
Yeah. And like you said earlier when I asked you about, would you be able to do what he did back then? Well, now that I think about it, it's really special that he went back to his home country, and then he's like, oh, it's not for me kind of thing, and he came back. And anything else you wanted to talk about?
Because also I see that like when he came back to Canada, Canada's a great country, but it didn't have any of the atrocities that Korea suffered. It wasn't subjugated during the wars or anything. So maybe he realized he could contribute more by being in Korea than being in Canada. Because Canada, yes, there's always things to improve, but it was reasonable back then. It's not like I said, there weren't any wars inside the actual geographical region of Canada or North America. So, but Korea was subjugated.
Exactly.
So I think he really wanted to kind of give what he had, yes, covering things, but also his knowledge, his love, all these kind of things. If you think about it, yes, there's foreigners in Korea now, around maybe 2 million-ish, but back then they weren't they were almost
like a
non-existent.
handful.
Exactly.
Yeah, the missionaries that we've been talking about in this series probably. And again, I touched lightly on this, but Schofield, the only Canadian that we're talking in part 3 series, and also the only one that really had a big action in the independence movement. So the other missionaries had amazing accomplishments for education, specifically advanced education, higher education, and also women's education, as well as medical education. And he touched up a little bit on that too later. After he came back to Korea, he had become a professor and was teaching. But the whole fighting for a whole different country that's not related to his, it's definitely different from the other missionaries that we had talked
definitely. As to kind of add on to that, back in those days, 1950s, Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. We're looking at maybe GDP of 600 per capita.
Completely different.
It's
to
very
what's
different,
going on now.
exactly.
So different.
But he still wanted to come because if you see that, most people are I'll just stay in my comfortable Western Hemisphere kind of thing. But he was I'm gonna come and help rebuild the country. I think that it's amazing, even with his physical challenges. But he's we have all the comfort of many things today, but back then they didn't have that. But still, he chose to come to Korea and play his part.
And I would think that if he was here today to see how Korea is now, he would be mind blown.
Oh, yes.
I don't think he would even imagine how Korea has developed into one of the top IT countries, fastest internet, more than that, AI and so forth. So talking about Frank Schofield in this sense, I want to say personally, definitely one of the people that I've learned to really admire without knowing it, because just learning about the history of him and his actions. And I felt his compassion for humanity is just through listening and learning. It's beyond what I can definitely feel everything through that. So I hope others, our viewers, are also able to understand why we are talking about him many years later. And it's important to understand the role that he played in Korean history. And we talked a really good amount of rich history and Schofield's achievements. So I really want to thank you, Andrew, for coming out again on our series.
Of course, it's an
being
honor.
Our guest this time, though, not as an MC. How was it?
It was
okay?
really good. And as a personal note, actually, we were talking about Severance Hospital, these things. And actually, yes, as a personal note, you are kind of related to that. Maybe you'll get to visit it soon because, you just got into Yonsei Graduate School of International Studies.
Andrew,
congratulations. Yes, we're both kind of from there. So it's
giving me really good advice on classes and stuff.
So I guess you could kind of revisit history by visiting the Severance Hospital and, the food court. And I'd imagine, I can't remember right now, but they probably have some sort of dedication to Frank Schofield in the hospital.
He was very involved in the foundation of the hospital and the school itself, so they have a really long history.
So maybe
I'll probably see his name somewhere.
Yes, and then maybe take a photo as well. And then, be proud that you were kind of involved in promoting, Frank Schofield and all the good things that he's done.
I can show off to my friends now how much I know about him. Thanks to this podcast, thanks to you.
And just as a background also, from what I remember, next year is the 60th anniversary of Canada-Korea relations.
Oh, wow.
Yes, so definitely we might be doing this again. To cover how Korea-Canada...
And you'll come back again with us to talk about it. That would be really good.
Yes, that'll be fun.
Revisiting Schofield again for our listeners, definitely. So actually, I definitely will look forward to working with you again for another collaboration if the opportunity comes. And this actually concludes our today's episode for Part 3, Human Library on Frank Schofield. I will greet you guys one last time on our final episode. The end is nearing, but the takeaway has been really fulfilling. I want to thank you for watching up until now, and we'll see you next week on the MIKU Podcast, Melt into Korea with us. Thank you, and bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.